Welcome to the SEA Centre's new podcast, Perspectives. We are a New Delhi-based think tank, and this podcast is a platform for our researchers to discuss technology policy issues in an accessible format.
Hi everyone and welcome to a new episode of our podcast Perspectives. I am Shweta, this is Maliha. We're both researchers at the SEA Center, and this week we're going to be discussing a draft law that the Karnataka government has proposed to regulate fake news and misinformation. So Maliha, why don't you kick us into it? What is this law trying to regulate? Why is it being considered now? And what do we know about it?
Right. Thanks, Shweta. Like you just said, it is highly contested, and the draft bill essentially has been tabled before the state cabinet, and it aims to regulate the rampant misinformation and fake news that is circulating on the internet today. Now, the categorization or the classification of fake news and misinformation has been understood because the draft is not available publicly. It's not accessible to us. News reports suggest that it aims to regulate information that is manipulated, distorted, and could impact public order, public health, public safety, and general election integrity. Given the nature of these, and by the way, it also includes certain newly introduced prohibited categories, which essentially go beyond reasonable restrictions that have been imposed under Article 19(2) of the Indian Constitution. These categories include anti-feminist speech, anything that could be construed to be disrespectful towards the Sanatan Dharma. It also includes generally content or statements that could be seen as obscene. So that is essentially the nature of what has been proposed.
Right. So from what you're saying, obviously it's a very wide ambit. I mean, it says fake news, misinformation, but clearly it's also going beyond that. It's going into, anti-feminist content, obscene content. But so circle back, why exactly are they considering this now? Is there any recent trigger? And what exactly is the sanction here? So what happens if someone posts this kind of content? What's the consequence?
Right. So essentially, from, again, news reports suggest that the government has been looking into curbing the menace that is fake news and misinformation, because for representatives of the government, this has caused a lot of ruckus in the recent times, and it has led to a lot of people believing information that is not fully credible. And I think the idea broadly here is to contain any chaos that could erupt because of such information being out there. The sanctions here are actually very interesting because the fines could go up to 10 lakh rupees, and imprisonment that is part of the punitive action here is about 7 years. Additionally, aiding and abetting could also, aiding and abetting such offences could also lead to about 2 years of jail time. As you can understand, these are hefty actions that have been brought in without a well-defined structure, because it leads to a little bit of a regulatory lack of clarity.
Right. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. They also there are a couple of other features also, aside from the prohibited categories of speech as well as these penalties. One feature, for example, is actually that the scope of this bill territorially is not just restricted to those within Karnataka. So let's say, I'm here in Delhi and you're in Karnataka, and I send you anti-feminist speech. I'm caught by this bill, so it could apply to me. So it's extraterritorial in the sense of it applies to people outside the state as well if they do one of the acts that this bill prohibits. It also actually proposes setting up this new regulatory authority called the Fake News on Social Media Regulatory Authority. From what we know in the news, this authority is supposed to be chaired by Kannada's Minister for Kannada and Culture, and it's also supposed to have representatives from social media companies, an IAS officer, one member from the Legislative Assembly and the Legislative Council. And, it also actually affects platforms because, so far we've been talking about users and what they post. But since the idea is to curb online misinformation, as you said, platform liability comes into the picture here as well. And what this bill basically says from news reports is that platforms can be held liable for any such speech. They can be fined up to 25,000, and criminal liability for platform employees is also on the table. So clearly a law with very wide ramifications if it comes through in its current form. But that brings me to the next part. What, to the top of your mind, what are the concerns you see with this law?
Right. So I think you shed light on a very important aspect, which is what this means for platforms. And for a little bit of a context, I think it's relevant to talk about how platforms are typically given a protection under the IT Act, which under Section 79 essentially means that the platforms are not liable for any content that is shared or circulated, posted generally by their users on the platforms. But like you just said, the current bill threatens this entire protection that is granted to platforms by also imposing potentially criminal liability as well as monetary liability on them. So that is one of the concerns. Another concern, more legally speaking, would be what this means for freedom of speech at large, right? And this we've seen emerge and evolve over time with cases like beginning from Shreya Singhal and also like the Bombay High Court and Kunal Kamra jurisprudence on what this means for freedom of speech. And I think it is essential to understand that time and time again we have realized that vaguely imposing curtailments and general restrictions on freedom of speech has not been taken well by the courts, because it strikes directly almost at the freedom of speech that is guaranteed under the Constitution of India. So that is one of the things. And then additionally, I think one of the bigger problems that I see is that there are very hefty penalties that are imposed without sufficient rail guards, in the sense that the terms are very vague. Now, anti-feminist is... what could constitute anti-feminist is rather subjective, and without well-defined, clear aspects of what that means, it could be a little slippery slope in terms of its implementation.
Yeah, and that actually also, the slippery slope gets me to another point actually, specifically with regard to fake news, but it's actually a broader point, I suppose. So especially given the way this bill conceives of fake news, again, the text isn't out, so we're basing this on news reports. But it seems to define fake news as information that is fabricated or that is manufactured. And the presumption seems to be that all fabricated information is inherently harmful. And while that premise is sort of understandable, it also glosses over ways in which speech works in today's realm. So I can use deepfakes as an example. Deepfakes tend to be considered inherently harmful in a lot of our discourse because, of course, we've seen harmful instances of women's bodies and faces being morphed. But deepfakes can also have extremely useful applications in medical research, and in fact, even when it comes to stuff like, say, AI. We've been talking a lot about hallucinations over the past years. The tendency of AI systems to throw out content that is not necessarily true. But if you look at how hallucinations can work, sometimes they're actually beneficial. So, for example, last year, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was given to some researchers who basically used AI hallucinations to discover a new protein structure that could, give the cure for Alzheimer's and such diseases. So the point being that just because something is fabricated or not necessarily real or factual does not always mean it's harmful. Sometimes it can be innovative in ways we don't see.
Yeah.
So, like you said, if there aren't sufficient guards to define, what is and is not acceptable speech, and it's not compliant with constitutional restrictions on speech, we could end up curbing speech that is potentially useful, or even if not useful, then certainly not harmful.
Right.
And it also goes to exactly what are we constituting here when we, think of this social media regulatory authority that I spoke about. You mentioned the Kunal Kamra judgment, which was on the fact check unit, which was basically the IT rules were amended in 2023 to introduce a fact check unit, which was supposed to check misinformation about the central government. The idea was that fact check unit would catch any misinformation, flag it, and then that content would have to be, taken down. That was the broad idea behind it. Now, in Kunal Kamra, the Bombay High Court struck down this fact-check unit, saying, among other grounds, firstly, that the kind of restriction on speech is not constitutionally permissible.
Yeah.
But it also flagged concerns with the government being a judge in its own cause here, because it said that the fact-check unit basically comprises government officials. And if we go to this fake news social media regulatory authority that the Karnataka government is thinking of constituting, sure, the composition is a little diverse. You've got some social media reps, you've got someone from the Legislative Assembly and Council, but certainly there is government representation there as well. And it is still an authority that is acting as an arbiter of truth.
Yeah.
And that becomes the problem. And in this judgment, the court also specifically said that when people have the right to information under Article 19 as part of the right to free speech, they don't have a right to truth. And it is not the government's role really to be the arbiter of truth in the name of safeguarding free expression and information. So I think that becomes one key concern as well. And in fact, the other puzzling thing with this authority in particular is the fact that it's supposed to be chaired by, I think, Karnataka's Minister for Kannada and Culture, which maybe ties into what you were saying about, some of the anti-feminist content or maybe content that disrespects Sanatana Dharma, but of course brings in those same wider concerns about where are we going in terms of speech implications. And I think also when it comes to the criminal liability front, like you said, that's a complete threat to safe harbor.
Yeah.
And also raises like this interesting question of a state law conflicting with a central law, and how does that exactly work? I think those probably make this law extremely vulnerable.
Yeah. Particularly when communication over the internet is ordinarily and typically considered to fall under the union list and is generally out of the purview of state governments. So it's interesting to see this development take place. But also, adding to what you had said earlier, I think two tenets that stand out to me are that misinformation and fake news are not necessarily confined to the online and digital space.
Mm-hmm.
I think another aspect and another reality that we live in today is fake news is around us everywhere, even in offline discussions and discourses, and that is. And it's allowed to freely. I'm not saying that it should be allowed generally, but there should be parity in how things are governed. And the issue of misinformation and fake news is very much part and parcel of our daily lives today. I think the more effective and long-term solution would be just creating general awareness amongst the citizenry and sensitization towards identification of information that comes their way and how to rely on credible sources and fact check for themselves instead of coming up with a regulation that would do this for them. And I think that has been taken into consideration given the general feedback that the government has been receiving. The government has agreed to review the law as it stands today. Do you want to shed some light on the status?
Yeah, I think the idea is that once people got wind of what this draft law has, there was considerable pushback, especially from civil society, who were concerned about its impact on civil liberties. And so currently the government says that it wants the bill to be reviewed by its IT department, by the Home Department, by a bunch of other departments that have not yet had the time to weigh in. And it's only after that it will consider tabling it. But what this means essentially is that the government is waiting for now and relooking, considering the kind of feedback it's gotten. So this law isn't yet it's not enforced, it's not even being tabled, but it's a good opportunity for the government to reflect on its approach to regulating misinformation. I think what we've laid out is that this law is constitutionally vulnerable for several reasons. And even from a pragmatic standpoint, even if the problem on misinformation is real, like you said, you need an informed citizenry, you need to teach people how to fact check reliably. A law that decides what is acceptable and what is not acceptable may not go very far. Right. So I think, that's the need of the hour, a calibrated, balanced approach, not overcorrecting either side on speech.
Yeah. Hopefully we will be seeing a draft for consultation soon. Yeah. And with that, we come to the end of this podcast. Thank you for tuning in.